very much for coming. If you're kind of milling around out there, our afternoon keynote is about to begin, so get your butts in here and get them in a seat. Some housekeeping, again, there is a raffle for an Amazon Echo. Those are the cool things that you can talk to, and it is out in the lobby by the registration table. Put your card in a bowl, and DigiCert is going to raffle off a Amazon Echo. So do that. Another thing worth noting, we are having a cocktail reception following today's events, starting at around 5 o'clock, and it's just across the lobby at New Bar, so you don't have to go far. And it's Resilient Systems, IBM, are the sponsors for that. So stick around. It's a great environment. It's casual. People talk. You can talk to people who you may have heard ask questions or whatever, but please stick around and join us for cocktails after the show. Without further ado, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our afternoon keynote speaker, which is Mr. Travis Goodspeed. And I must say, this is when people say, well, Travis Goodspeed, what does Travis Goodspeed do? And you're like, well, he's like an independent security researcher. What is his title? He prefers really not to have one. When I asked him what his title was, he said, I'm just a person. But he's actually selling himself way short. He's one of the most recognized security experts, both on embedded systems, wireless devices, going. In fact, when I was kind of starting to put this agenda together, I had a conversation with Pete Zeitko, aka Mudge, who was at DARPA for a while and at Google for a while. And I was like, well, who would you come to see? And he was like, I would come to see like Travis Goodspeed. So I was like, okay, well, that's pretty good recommendation. So he's going to talk to us today, kind of about, we were talking about it, I mean, really about junk hacking and the value of junk hacking, the value of taking a security researcher's eye on devices that might not seem inherently like important connected critical systems, but might actually tell you a lot of really important things about how safety critical systems, critical infrastructure function, work, and might be compromised or might be secured. So I ask you to put your hands together and welcome Mr. Travis Goodspeed. Thank you very much.
Howdy do. So I'm going to begin with a couple of stories, and then I'm going to show you a bit about how reverse engineering Internet of Things devices and that class of device actually works, and what sort of vulnerabilities people exploit in the real world when attacking real things. The vulnerabilities that I'm going to show you are real vulnerabilities that can be applied against real targets. The reason why I'm showing them is not to harp on that specific vulnerability, because a lot of these targets are not things that need to be secured. Show of hands, who thinks that it's important that graphing calculators not run third-party software, and that this is something that we as an industry need to focus on and defend? I don't see a single hand. But a lot of effort goes into this. There is digital rights management in graphing calculators. They have been as locked down as the iPhone since before the iPhone existed. And there are teenagers and university students who reverse engineer this in order to be able to run their own games and their own event calendar software. And they've been doing this for decades, and the tricks that they use also apply toward the embedded systems that you do care about defending, the things that run your business, the things that might be attacked. And because the graphing calculator is not a sensitive target, no one is going to be trying to decide the trolley debate over whether 3 people get run over or 1 person gets run over based upon publishing the vulnerability. It gives us the freedom to talk about it in a way that we can only do because it's junk, and it's not a particularly sexy target. I'd like to thank Sergey Bratis, Paula, DD4CR, Joshua Wright, Ryan Spears, and Dan Ebel. I've not met Dan Ebel in person, but I would really like to, if you happen to know what became of him since 1994 when he published the Z-shell for the TI-85 graphing calculator. I'm going to begin with a story about Ralph. Ralph is a little bit insane. So I do ham radio as a hobby, and you meet a lot of different and interesting people on ham radio. Ralph is not so much a doomsday prepper as one of those guys who's always like trying to come up with something sneaky that he can get away with. For example, he has this theory about using wasp spray in self-defense. Because if he gets caught with a can of wasp spray, it's not the same as mace, and there could be a wasp, so he has every right to have it. Do not take any legal advice from Ralph. Do not base any career or life decisions on Ralph. But Ralph does occasionally do some interesting stuff. One day, he was at a sheriff's auction, and he purchased his own radar gun. The sort that the police use when they're trying to pull over cars, maybe a couple of years out of date, maybe uncalibrated, but he's got it and he's really excited about it. So what Ralph did was he drove to the Wendy's, and he sat in the Wendy's parking lot just zapping cars as they drove by. And the sheriff's department is on a first-name basis with Ralph because they get called on him so often. And they come over to say howdy to Ralph, and they're like, Ralph, cut it out. Like, you're being a jerk. And he's like, you can't stop me, the Constitution. And they're like, Ralph, we're not arresting you. We're not charging you. We're just telling you to go home. We're sick of getting called out here. Like, this isn't, like, what are you doing? Why are you wasting our time like this? And he's like, well, you know, I got my radar gun. You stole me the radar gun. You can't stop me. And they're like, Ralph, that's not the point. The point is that we're sick of coming out here. We're sick of the hassle that you're causing, and like we'd really like you to just politely move on, and we can call it a day. So Ralph did move on to Klingman's Dome, which is the highest point in southern Appalachia. And there's this thing about where Albert Einstein was trying to explain how radio works. And he's like, well, it's like you pull a cat's tail in one city and it meows in another, and the difference is that there is no cat. In this case, as he's standing in the observation tower here, he can see more than 100 miles apiece of Interstate 75 and Interstate 40, through which a lot of people have radar detectors, and by swinging his radar gun across, he was able to watch the brake lights slam on throughout 200 miles of the interstate highway system. And he was able to do this not because he was particularly clever. If you think that he's particularly clever, I can share some more of his legal theories with you. But he's able to do this because that's how the system works. You've got a radar gun on one end, and you have a radar detector on the other end that is trying to be as sensitive as possible and is trying to be compatible with as many different radar devices as it can be. It's not trying to eliminate false positives because no one ever rejects a radar detector because it goes off too often by the grocery store. They reject it because they get a speeding ticket while having it. So in the case of the radar system, you've got the system that's very easy to create false positives for. And that was the vulnerability that he was exploiting. And this didn't require any special knowledge or training. It just required one jerk to purchase a radar gun and aim it at a highway from a mountain. If he wanted to, he could build like an amplifier for this. And it goes line of sight. And you can build amplifiers that put out more than a kilowatt. Ralph would point out that his amateur radio license grants him permission to do that. Which is another one of Ralph's legal theories, because you're not allowed to do it to cause trouble, you're not allowed to do it on those frequencies. But Ralph's legal theories aside, he's perfectly capable of purchasing a kit, assembling it, and connecting his radar gun to it to have a tower on a mountain set off every radar detector for 100 miles. So there's this really old vulnerability that I like in the Texas Instruments 85 graphing calculator. You might have had one of these when you were in school. Your kids certainly have them in school. They all have the Texas Instruments brand because that's the way that the marketing worked out. So this fellow named Dan Ebel wrote a program called Z-Shell. And this is a screenshot of it here. What Z-Shell lets you do is it lets you run other programs which are written in machine language. It ships as a zip file for DOS. It contains a little bit of documentation. It tells you how to make a couple of calls to the operating system. And it translates the function calls to move them to the right location because there's no dynamic linking on this platform, and each version of the ROM has things in a different location. Now, the TI-85 graphing calculator has a Zilog Z80 CPU. If any of you remember the Tandy Radio Shack Trash 80, this is the same CPU. I see one guy in the back who's like really excited about the Trash 80. And from that, I know that he never tried to play a video game on the thing. Although the Model 100 was great. They had like a little portable one for reporters. It has a basic programming environment. So you have variables which have short names, A, B, C, D, X. And you can assign them a value which is either an integer or a floating point number. You also have strings and some other things like that. But this is a high-level and very slow programming language. Machine code would be a lot faster, and the CPU can certainly run it. RAM is executable. It supports doing all of this. But the machine code is forbidden. You're not allowed to run your own software on it. The reason why is that when you're in the 8th grade and you're getting your first graphing calculator, they tell you that it's a big responsibility because this graphing calculator is so powerful. The truth is actually the opposite. In 1984, they had machines that can do symbolic calculus that will fit in your pocket and run on an N-cell battery, like the Hewlett-Packard 28, for example. The one that they give you in the 8th grade is intentionally crippled to not do algebra, to not do the fancy stuff, and to not do games. So what you would really like to do is to be able to pop it in order to run foreign machine code, not for any like malicious hacking purpose, but just to be able to run Mario. And there are excellent remakes of Mario for this platform, especially when you consider that there's no video accelerator or sprite engine or anything like that. You could even do hardware modifications to add sound. I nearly got thrown out of pre-cal for that one. So there's this, the thing supports a backup, where you can actually send a backup of memory to the host computer, and you can change it, and then you can write it back. Whenever you control something that's later going to be in device memory, you're a lot closer to actually smuggling in new code. The trouble is that all of the existing software is in permanent masked read-only memory. This is set from the factory. You will never update it. It only changes when they do a new revision of the chip. It's stuck forever. So you can't actually change any of the operating system because it's not included in the backup. The backup is only of RAM. You do get this thing called a custom menu. And the custom menu contains copies of the main menu items. So that the things you do the most often, like absolute value or square root, can be at the top row of the calculator. This is implemented with a string and a function pointer. And this can be modified in the backup, so you can change the function pointer to make it execute memory from anywhere inside of the machine, which means that you can execute arbitrary code. The trouble is that you need to know where to put the code. The variables themselves move around in memory. So when you put the value 37 into variable A might be at a different location 3 commands later. It's still the same to the basic environment. It's still the same A when you type the letter in your calculator, but inside of the machine it gets moved around. And everything in memory moves around, so there's no like safe place to store it. If you try to put it in an unused region of memory, then as the device is filled up, eventually that will be overwritten too. There's no way to tell the system to avoid it. So like, where can you put it that it will always be at a consistent location, in physical memory that the device can't miss it and that you can have a consistent pointer to. What you do is you make artwork for the screen that contains both the name of the software you're running and just a little stub of machine code that goes and finds the rest and runs it. So the way that you would actually run this is that first you would load a picture onto the screen, and then you would execute the picture as code, as two separate commands. This is in 1994. Since then, Texas Instruments opened up the calculators to allow for machine language programming, and then they locked it down again. And then they opened it up again, and then they locked it down again. And then they opened it up again, and they locked it down again. 3 full cycles of this. Nearly 20 years have gone by. 19 years later, there's this toy that comes out called Tamagotchi Friends. And Natalie Silvanovich, who's brilliant, she's responsible for between 1/4 and 1/3 of all vulnerabilities found in Adobe Flash in the past year. She wanted to exploit this thing in order to run it in an emulator and figure out all of its behavior. It has a 6502 chip that's based on an LCD controller. So the whole thing is the LCD controller, and then they have like a custom mask ROM. It supports external artwork from SPI Flash, and she was also able to exploit this in the same way. So she's able to run this exact picture as native code in the device, and then it will blink out all of its memory through an LED. This is how you can emulate the toy today. She later did a follow-up for one that had no software vulnerability using voltage glitching. So this same exploitation trick of putting something in video memory so that you know that it's executable and you know where it's executable survived for 19 years and will probably survive for 19 or 20 more. The tricks themselves don't die. So what Dan Ebel was using in 1994 still worked in 2013, still works today in 2016. And junk hacking, the hacking of things that like officially don't matter, allows us to talk about the mechanism that actually allowed it to happen while stepping back from the moralizing. Show of hands, is anyone in this room morally offended that children can hack their Tamagotchi toy? Okay. There's a related piece, which is Wright's principle. This is the idea that security doesn't get better until tools are available for practical exploration of the attack surface. Practical exploration means exploitation. Means being able to sniff the packets and inject them and participate in the attack surface so that you have visibility and so that you're able to try out vulnerabilities, to try exploiting them, to try injecting random things. How many of you have this card, the Orinoco Gold, or remember having it? Yeah. So this card and a related card called the Prism 2 came out at about the same time. These are PCMCIA cards. You'd plug this into your tank of a laptop with an hour or two of battery life. And by running a program in Linux or in Windows, you would then be able to sniff packets promiscuously in monitor mode. And before that, monitor mode wasn't available. So before that, you were only able to get the network packets that the card allowed you to have. You could only get the ones that were addressed to you. With this card, you could then get the packets that were addressed to anybody on that channel. You could also receive encrypted packets. It wouldn't decrypt them for you, but it would give you the encrypted form, and you could try decrypting them yourself. And then there's a particularly handy trick, which is that you can use these to inject a raw frame. And the way that this worked was very ugly. You would actually overwrite the copy of the packet that you had just sent with new data, because as you send a packet, the card sort of corrects it. It says, oh, you're sending it from somebody else's address. I'm going to fix it to be your address. But then it takes a bit of time before it actually goes out over the air, and you can overwrite it during that time. So what you would sort of do is you would overwrite it, and you would erase the card in order to change the packet before it left. But this worked, and this allowed for raw injection. So with raw reception and raw rejection, suddenly Wi-Fi security opened up. prior to this, folks knew in theory that WEP was probably a bad way to secure the wireless network. But they couldn't point to a specific example. They couldn't show how bad it was. With 2 of these cards, you could suddenly crack WEP and begin attacking these targets and trying it out against your own network and seeing that the network itself was not really secure. And it was only then that the security began to get better. Within the few years after this became available, there were then memory corruption exploits against the drivers for wireless cards. That becomes particularly handy because then you realize that mistakes in the drivers, mistakes which are copied between multiple operating systems, are exploitable on multiple operating systems. And that the diversity of your Windows laptop and my Linux laptop and his Mac might not mean that we're running such different code. You can adapt other buses. This is a device that I made back when I was in college. This is the GoodFET. And it's a very simple device, and all that it does is adapt an embedded bus to USB so that your laptop can talk over what's called the SPI protocol, the serial peripheral interface, to say a radio chip. And then you can write your own driver for that radio chip in Python on your laptop without having to write any new firmware. Without having to do any embedded systems programming at all, you're then able to hop onto the embedded systems network. This was followed up by a series of boards. The APmote shown here was produced by Dartmouth students. It runs the GoodFET firmware and connects back to the Killer Bee framework that Joshua Wright began. With this, you're able to connect to a ZigBee network, and you're able to inject and sniff packets on it. We were able to come up with what's called the packet-in-packet attack, where by controlling layer 7 data, we are able to inject a layer 1 frame. Absent any software vulnerability, this happens in hardware. I don't have time to include it in the slides, but I can describe it on a napkin afterward. And it's a very fun story to tell. You can also install new firmware onto existing hardware. So, my students were manufacturing the APmote, but this is a Spanish device, the Zelertia Z1. It's an early ZigBee development kit. This can also run the GoodFET firmware. And using my firmware, you can connect a micro USB cable to your computer, and you can hop on the ZigBee network. You can receive the packets, you can transmit them. You can do this for vendor proprietary technologies as well. This was a hacker conference badge that I made in 2010 for the Next Hope conference. The badge itself runs what's called the Open Beacon protocol, which is used for conventions so that your badges can announce where they are, and based upon the reception, you can kind of figure out who's hanging out with whom and in which rooms they are. Do people avoid the vendor aisle because it's too loud and flashy, or do they stick to a particular conference hall just because there's room to sit? You can figure this out with the data afterward. So for the Next Hope conference, we ran this network and invited people to attack it. The badge itself is designed so that you can add a USB chip and a USB plug, connect it to your laptop, and then have a network adapter. The radio that it uses is also used by other devices. This is the Turning Point clicker. So large chemistry classes will have this. I was actually in Boston at the MIT bookstore when they threatened to sue me for reading the code out of it. This device is completely unprotected. I'll show you in a bit how you can hook wires up to it and read it out. But it uses the same chip as the Next Hope badge uses. So you're able to capture the packets off of the air and then see which buttons are being pressed. You could write a script to always vote with the majority. You can recognize other things, such as that the range of this device is rather limited. So sometimes the back of the class gets a poor attendance score because the professor at the front can't receive the packets from them. Now, a Turning Point is like a small name vendor. Like when they threatened to sue me, it was their CEO on the phone yelling at me individually. I don't know how many high-powered CEOs you folks know, but the ones I know that are high-powered do not bother threatening grad students personally. They have staff for that. Or lawyers, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you send the paralegal to threaten the grad student. This is a screenshot from another device that uses the same radio chip. The text window in the foreground is the input for a Macintosh, in which some lines from a poem are being typed. The text in the background is the packet capture being reassembled. This is from a Microsoft Wireless keyboard. The original vulnerability was discovered by Max Moser and Torsten Schroeder in 2008. And then it has been re-exploited separately in different ways for the past 8 years. In my case, I figured out how to do it with a nifty little trick using the single chip. But these things don't get fixed. The hardware remains vulnerable over time. So your little classroom remote or your keyboard will get a minor change to it to say that the old vulnerability doesn't work. And then a few years down the line, it's exploited again. There's some other applications of Wright's principles. So there's this software called CrackLE by Mike Ryan, which is able to crack the Bluetooth low energy pairing. So you're then able to capture the session keys and decrypt traffic. This would be a purely theoretical attack, except that modern software-defined radios allow you to receive very complicated, very fast signals using rather cheap hardware on your laptop, and it's only going to get cheaper. There's also GR LoRa by Matt Knight. LoRa is this new protocol for long-range Internet of Things. So if you have a small device that needs to set off in the unattended and with low battery power, and it just needs to chirp out a sensor reading once every hour, LoRa allows you to collect that. It's extremely limited in bandwidth, but it's supposed to provide very good range, and it has some protocol advantages that I don't yet understand. But using GR LoRa, you're now able to capture these packets and begin to investigate the security of them. We don't know today whether LoRa is secure, but we probably will within 6 months as people begin to experiment with it. Now, your firmware can be read out. And as it can be read out, it can be interpreted. There are very, very good disassemblers these days. When I was a student, I had to write disassemblers for the platforms that I would work with. Nowadays, IDA Pro supports all of them. Radara 2 supports all of them. Hopper supports a lot of them, and Binary Ninja is catching up. It's a new product that's very cheap. Your investment for anything but IDA Pro will be on the order of $100, $400 professionally. There are also good decompilers. This is a screenshot of IDA Pro loading firmware to a handheld radio. After it loads it up, you can navigate around, identify where the functions are, and begin to give them names and to figure out how it functions. When someone is attacking your device, writing a new attack for the device, this is the first stage after extracting the firmware, to actually run through and figure out what it does, which pieces are relevant. There are decompilers as well. So assembly language is very verbose. It takes a lot of instructions to represent something that might be in very few lines of C code. Nowadays, Hexbase has perfect decompilers for x86, AMD 64, ARM, Thumb, 64-bit ARM, and PowerPC. Any application large enough to be trouble to reverse engineer by hand, it can do semi-automatically. You still have to give things names because the names aren't included. But this idea that reading the code is too labor-intensive for an attacker to bother is hogwash. Those days are over. The labor required continuously becomes less. And in embedded systems, in Internet of Things devices, you're particularly constrained because there's little memory. there's not room for a lot of code to provide trouble to the reverse engineer. You also have excellent ARM toolchains, which are all sort of based around the same compiler. So there's less diversity in the dialect of machine language, which means that the decompilers are then more reliable. And the instruction set diversity is no longer so tricky. The smaller devices with their own weird instruction sets are fast going away as everyone standardizes on ARM. And your firmware will be dumped. I talked to a lot of embedded systems engineers who are convinced that it's too much trouble to read their code out. But there are tricks that you can use to extract them, and these tricks work. You can just ask politely. So with this device, I just soldered up a couple of wires, and I ran the debugging protocol. I'm going to jump down here for a second. There are a couple of chips here. This little one off to the bottom left, that is just a memory chip. This one here in the center, that is both a radio chip and a CPU. When you are designing a chip, it's rather easy to add a CPU to anything because a CPU is just logic. Memory requires process-specific stuff because you need to create little flash or EEPROM memory cells. And the radio requires that you know the exact values of tricky analog components. So while it's very easy to add a CPU to some memory or to add a CPU to a radio, it's very difficult to combine the radio and the memory. So all of the first generation chips that implemented these sorts of things would have the radio and the memory separate. In this device, the memory chip is external, and the memory has to be copied into the CPU every single time the device starts. So by reading this out, you're able to get a complete copy of the code and begin reverse engineering it. One trick that I really like using is null pointer dereference. In Windows and in Unix, these can be exploited in tricky situations. They're used for privilege escalation attacks, things where you already have some control of code and you're trying to do something more. And the reason why is that when you try to read from address 0, there's a guard page there and it will fault, and the operating system will cause your program to crash. In embedded systems, you don't have a guard page because you don't have a memory management unit to protect you. So in embedded ARM machines, whenever you have an uninitialized buffer, like the buffer hasn't been allocated, so it still points to 0, in ARM, for convenience, they put a copy of flash memory at address 0. So if you read the 32-bit word at address 0, you get the top of the stack. And if you read the one at address 4, you get the entry point address for the firmware. And if you keep reading, you'll get a complete copy of the firmware. So these null pointer dereferences, which are not a very serious bug on the host side, can be trivially exploited by anyone who can request data from you before it's ready. There are also firmware updates. So these are easily found when they're available. You go to the manufacturer's website, you say, hey, I would like to update to the latest version, and they give you a download. Well, often these are encrypted, but they're encrypted poorly. This device is the Titera MD380. It's an amateur radio that some friends and I have been reverse engineering, and we're now adding new features to it. For example, this is a digital radio. It has a 3-byte source address. So when someone calls me, it can look his name up in my address book and tell me that it's Ralph calling. And because I know that it's Ralph, maybe I keep the volume down. Or you can patch the firmware, and you can add an address book of all 35,000 users of this radio in the amateur community. And then when I get a call from someone in South Africa that I've never met before, on say a public channel, it's normal to get calls from South Africa, it will show me his name, his call sign, city, state, zip code. But the programming software is awful. This is actually trying to render Chinese text in the Latin alphabet, which is why none of the title bars can be read. So I used a null pointer dereference to dump the first 48 kilobytes of this device's memory. And then I changed the bootloader. I changed 1 byte. There's a 5.5 here, I changed that to an AA. So instead of being like 0101, flipped it the other way. It's 1010. What this does is it makes the device not lock out the debugger when it boots. So now I have a bootloader that can decrypt the firmware update and install it and allow me to attach a debugger to read the firmware out. This then gave me a pair. I then had the firmware both encrypted and decrypted. Well, you can then attack the cryptography. A lot of times the developer doesn't really pay attention to what modes they're using or how they're using it because they're trying to make a product that they can ship. They're not trying to have perfect crypto. They don't want to sit in another meeting arguing over whether they should use counter mode or ECB mode or the rest. So my friend DD4CR, she took the clear text image that I had ripped out and the encrypted image that you can download from the manufacturer's website, and she exclusive OR'd them with each other and got the same repeating 512-bit pattern that is the key that you need to encrypt or decrypt any firmware image, the cipher stream. And this worked because they were using counter mode and resetting the nonce every 512 bytes. So with that, it was then possible to decrypt a firmware update, patch it, and then re-encrypt it so that it could be used with the original manufacturer's firmware updater. We're now shipping these firmware updates. We have been for about 6 months. And folks can download the firmware and they can install it. And they do this as a hobbyist thing. They can then install the phone book of all 35,000 users. They can enable fancy startup graphics and a promiscuous mode. We're adding fancy GPS support. Very soon, you'll be able to take it outside, aim it at the sky, turn it on, and it will automatically find the nearest repeaters and program them in so that you can start making calls. And this is possible because of the exact same tricks that will be used to attack your industrial equipment or your medical equipment or your scientific equipment. There are JTAG locks. So a JTAG debugger is what's used in order to connect to the device to see what code it's executing, how it executes it. You can stop it. You can move forward one step at a time. You can tell it that you want it to run as fast as normal until it goes to this address, and then you want it to stop cold in its tracks. But this is usually disabled. There will be a fuse or there will be a setting. And so when this happens, the attacker would really like to be able to get those features back because that provides a clear text copy of the firmware. That provides the ability to more quickly reverse engineer how the firmware behaves. So one of the tricks you could use to get around this, and there are several, one trick is you can do fault injection. So you can remove the lid of the chip, and then you hit the lid of the chip with a camera flash. Show of hands, how many of you know what a transistor does? Okay. How many of you know what a phototransistor does? Did you know that a transistor is just a phototransistor with an opaque lid over it? So when you hit this thing with a camera flash, a lot of the flip-flops get knocked into the wrong state, including the one that's remembering whether or not the device is supposed to be protected. Now, no one's going to do this to your devices in the field. They're going to steal one device from the field, take it home, and do it comfortably in an office, and use that reverse engineered knowledge to then go back and attack the devices in bulk. There's also this concept of a mask-ROM bootloader. So as you're developing a device, you write the software for it. And maybe you're very careful. Maybe you're perfectly careful. And maybe there are no hardware vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And you know that all the software is great. This is a fairy tale, but like in theory it could happen. There's one more program that's not yours, and that is the mask-ROM bootloader. Changing this bootloader very often requires a mask revision. So if you call the vendor up and you say, hey, I really like your bootloader, but there's a bug in there. I'd like you to fix it. Well, they have to do an entire mask change. This is a photograph of the chip under an electron microscope. The region that we'll be zooming in on is right about here. But you don't call it zooming in, because when you use an electron microscope, it's very expensive. you need to have an operator, and you talk to the operator. So what you do is you say enhance. And then if we enhance it one more time, this little like Egyptian tablet type thing, this is a mask ROM. Those little dots are bits. If you want to change one of those bits, you have to redo that layer of the chip. That is $250,000 if you're lucky. That is more than $1 million if you're unlucky. When you report a bug in these, the vendor will tell you to go to hell, because it's too expensive to patch it. If you have an exploitable bug in one of these, then you can exploit and dump firmware out of any device in that family, even if everything else is perfect from that design studio. There are a few things that I would like you to read. This is the International Journal of Proof of Concept, or Get the Fuck Out. Our next issue will be coming out in San Diego, in Sao Paulo, and in Budapest next month. It's free online. You can print your own copies. There is no copyright. Charlie Miller had a paper a few years back on battery hacking. And he was not able to make the battery catch on fire. So everyone ignored the details in the paper. But it's not 38 pages to say that he can't make it catch on fire. It's 38 pages to show exactly how he reverse engineered it in order to get code execution on it. And you should read this paper in order to see how a real-world device is taken apart, and how the different roadblocks, such as an undocumented instruction set or an unlabeled chip, can be circumvented, and how the reverse engineering works anyways. You should read tutorials on how to make toy electronics, because they teach you how to talk to all of these parts. All of the chips that I've shown you today are used in Arduino and Raspberry Pi and Adafruit style devices. And you can buy these kits and play with them and become familiar with them without any particular challenge. They're very well documented. This is something that you can do at home. You should get a ham radio license and start playing around with building your own radios and building your own filters. You don't have to be advanced at it to start. Everybody starts with a kit and then works their way forward. And this is a way to teach you that electronics are tractable, and that reverse engineering is tractable, and it's a skill that you can learn. Before I did this, I made church windows. That's how I learned soldering as a stained glass artist, and I was a terrible stained glass artist. I was also a terrible auto mechanic, but you can learn these things. You can look up data sheets for most chips from Western firms. This is a bit harder for Asian-designed chips, but anything that's designed in Europe or the Americas, you can order the documentation from the website. You can download it, and you can read it, and it will tell you exactly what the chip does and how it behaves, how to talk to it. You can order development kits in order to begin playing with those chips. And the same goes for the protocols. The different radio protocols that are coming out, LoRa and ZigBee and the rest, they're trying to get you to use these protocols. So a lot of the documentation is available. If it's not freely available, you search for the name of the document, and then the word confidential, and then the word PDF. There's also this website in China called Docin, D-O-C-I-N. And the way that it works is that when you register, you get 1 yuan bean, and you can download a PDF file for free. If you want a second PDF document, you have to upload confidential documents of your own in order to get more yuan beans. Engineers use this in order to get data sheets, and then they share anything that they don't think is terribly confidential. So you could very often get non-public data sheets this way in order to learn how the parts work. And I suggest that whatever you care about in your own business, whatever equipment you depend upon, buy one spare and take it apart with a screwdriver and see what's inside of it. Look up the part numbers, take a notebook and draw little pictures, and figure out what it's actually doing as opposed to what it's supposed to be doing. Thank you kindly, and this is a picture of a cat.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're running a little bit behind. Do you want to take like one question? Can you take one question?
I'll take one question, and then I'll move out in the hallway, and
Right.
you can pester me in person.
Sounds good. Are there questions for Mr. Goodspeed? No? Okay. Has napkin, will travel. Meet him up in the...
And the cat's name is Mimine. She's a very good cat.
Hey, Travis, thank you so much. Yeah, big hand.